All right, welcome. Thanks for coming. We are going to spend the next couple days talking about this theme of becoming the leaders God needs us to be. I have spent the last week worrying about this presentation, actually. And before I start, I just want to make the disclaimer that I'm going to say hard things and I'm going to say unpleasant things. I had to look at a lot of ugly and sick and distorted information to get you the information I'm going to share this morning. It was not a pleasant experience, but I just kept feeling like it was necessary. So hopefully what we're going to talk about this morning will be helpful to some of you in some way, but it opens the stage for really how absolutely vital it is. And I'll just say before I begin, we cannot afford to not act now. We cannot afford to allow ourselves to get in the way, to make excuses, or to think that we're not good enough, we're not ready. All of those things are just lies that will stop us from doing what needs to be done. Okay, so Gabriel Kuby said, "We are in the middle of an astonishing process. Fundamental standards of human behavior that were generally considered valid just a few decades ago have now been put to pasture. What was good back then is now considered bad." And of course we know from the book of Isaiah that this was prophesied many, many centuries ago. "Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." In 1984, after World War II, the countries got together and they drew up a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this is one of the first rights that they wrote. "The family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and it is entitled to protection by society and the state." Went on to talk about how family is the marriage between a man and a woman. It's made up of individuals who want to have children and be monogamous, and that this is a high moral standard, but that it's necessary. In the very same year, another book was published by a man named Alfred Kinsey. So Alfred Kinsey was raised in the slums of New York in a strict Methodist family. And at a young age, he experienced sexual frustration, which he was known to pray to try to overcome. And when this didn't work out and he got into his 20s, he became disenchanted. He felt like religion was hypocritical, and he left his faith behind. One biographer said, "He remained religious until his 20s when he lost his religion and turned with fury on religion. He thought it was hypocritical, the frustration, sexual frustration that he felt as a result of his father's strictures. That anger remained with him all of his life." And one of his colleagues that was later interviewed also said that his closest colleagues believed that his anger fueled his research. So this was the center of what he was about. This is what was fueling the work that he was involved in. He decided that human sexuality had never been studied properly, and so he was going to engage in the study of human sexuality. And the way that this was brought about, and in fact, it's known several places, it's covered up, the information is out there if you go looking for it. But he did a handful of things. One thing that he did was he decided that in order to study human sexuality, he and his colleagues should engage in every type and form imaginable for humans to engage in human sexuality. And he also brought a videographer from Hollywood, and they videotaped hundreds of every imaginable sexual behavior. He also worked with pedophiles. And he found pedophiles that were currently active in their pedophilia. He did not turn them into the authorities. He protected them under what he called how do they call it? Their privacy policies. And there was one man in particular who'd been a pedophile for 12 years in Arizona, actually. He worked for the government, and he took detailed notes in these journals. And he actually hid it in the desert so that these journals couldn't be found. He talked this guy into handing them over to him. And then he had actually worked with other scientists who Kinsey had worked with to tell him how to take notes in ways that were more scientific. Anyway, what was found from him and from other pedophiles that they interviewed in prisons and other people that sent in information, they made calls out in newspapers for information of anybody involved in any sexual practice to write in. In fact, so much information was sent in, it's still never been gone through and organized. Anyway, that's almost all of chapter 5 on childhood sexuality was taken from the journals of pedophiles. So later on, in the 80s or 90s, a documentary was made about him. People were interviewed, and the then head president of the Kinsey Institute, his name was John Bancroft at the time, the interviewer was asking him about the legitimacy of using this information and why Kinsey had done that. And the institute director said, I think people have got to ask themselves the question, do they believe research into sexuality should be done or should not be done? Particularly research into sexuality, which might be, in some sense, might be illegal. And then the reporter asked, but if the cost potentially is to put children more at risk of abuse, can that cost be justified? And the director of the Kinsey Institute said, consider the cost of remaining ignorant. Unless we know about these behaviors, we'll be in a much worse position than if we have more information about them. That was Kinsey's view. Kinsey didn't ask anybody to carry out a particular form of sexual behavior. He simply asked them to let him know of any experiences they'd had. That's not actually true. He did actually ask people to engage in behaviors. So, in the same year that this Declaration of Human Rights was being written at an international level, the book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, was published, and it sold over 300,000 copies in the United States almost overnight. He was a superstar. There were 5 to 6 page spreads on him and on his book in all the major magazines. Life, Time, you can go back and see these. This is what Kinsey wrote. Unless we want to close our eyes to the truth or imprison 95% of our male population, we must completely revise our legal and moral codes. And so that's what happened. He traveled around the world, he met with dignitaries and heads of state around the world, and he consulted them on laws that needed to be changed, sodomy laws and all kinds of other human sexual laws, easy divorces, et cetera, et cetera. And then later on, this was from 48 to 56, he advised the Wolfenden Committee on Homosexuality in Britain and went all over Europe advising these governments. At the same time, actually, the following year, in 1949, Simone de Beauvoir, hopefully I said that right, wrote The Second Sex, which was a foundational book for the second wave of feminism that happened in the 60s. She was in an open relationship with Jean-Paul Sartre, and they were the founders of postmodernism movement, which makes a lot more sense to all of us in level 3 and in the academy. We know what that's about. We also know that many of the founders of postmodernism in 1977 were signed a petition and actively worked toward lowering the age of consent in France. The age of consent was 15, but for other behaviors like sodomy and adult child behaviors, it was 18, and they petitioned to lower the age of consent in France to more normalize sexuality there. They were openly Marxist. They petitioned for socialism, Foucault, Sartre, Derrida, all those individuals. In the meantime, Margaret Sanger, who we know as the founder of Planned Parenthood, was over here in America working on eugenics and all kinds of other things, putting Planned Parenthood together. She was working really hard to raise money for the first oral contraceptive. Finally, in 1960, it was without actually a whole lot of FDA research, but on the market. And so the sexual revolution truly began. And then in 62 and 63, the laws were passed that removed the Bible and prayer from schools. And then, of course, in 1973, Roe versus Wade was passed. So about the time that I was being born, all of these laws had been passed, all of these books had been published, and we were well on our way to the place that we are now 50 years later. Now, interestingly, a man named J.D. Unwin in 1934, before any of this began, wrote a book. He wanted to test Sigmund Freud's thesis. And of course, much of this goes back to Freud. We know that Freud was also actively very anti-religion, anti-Christianity, very openly so. And so Sigmund Freud had one postulate, and that was that culture arises through the sublimation of the sexual drive. And I actually wrote down the definition of sublimation. It's interesting to see it in this light. It means to move something from an unacceptable form to one that is considered more socially or culturally acceptable. So for Freud, the fact that sexual behaviors were not openly discussed, were not normalized, and that there was this repression of sexual behavior is what caused problems in the culture. So Unwin decided to do several years of research on this proposition to try to prove or disprove it. And fascinatingly, he just didn't have any idea what he was getting into. He said later he was absolutely shocked by the results. And I'm going to read you what his findings were. In Sex and Culture, the ethnologist and social anthropologist J.D. Unwin studied 80 primitive tribes and 6 known civilizations through 5,000 years of history, and found a positive correlation between the cultural achievement of a people and the sexual restraint they observe. Sex and Culture is a work of the highest importance, Aldous Huxley wrote. Unwin's conclusions, which are based upon an enormous wealth of carefully sifted evidence, may be summed up as follows. All human societies are in one or another of 4 cultural conditions: zoistic, monistic, deistic, or rationalistic. Of these societies, the zoistic displays the least amount of mental and social energy, the rationalistic the most. Investigation shows that the societies exhibiting the least amount of energy are those where prenuptial continence is not imposed and where the opportunities for sexual indulgence after marriage are greatest. The cultural condition of a society rises in exact proportion as it imposes prenuptial and postnuptial restraints upon sexual opportunity. According to Unwin, after a nation becomes prosperous, it becomes increasingly liberal. We see this through many civilizations with regard to sexual morality, and as a result loses its cohesion, its impetus, and its purpose. The process, says the author, is irreversible. The whole of human history does not contain a single instance of a group becoming civilized unless it has been absolutely monogamous, nor is there any example of a group retaining its culture after it has adopted less rigorous customs. Gabriel Kubi said on Unwin's findings, high culture can only exist with strict sexual morals, monogamy, and virginity before marriage. Only when a society is able to keep to that, which is difficult, then you have high culture. As soon as society lets go of it, the culture drops down and leaves the stage of history within 3 generations. Now we know all about first principles, and we know that there's a universality about sexual behavior across cultures. The first principle, as I've been able to delineate it, looks something like this. There must be parameters around human sexuality for the individual, the family, and society to be safe and prosperous. People have intuitively known that, and budding civilizations have had high restraint on sexual behavior. We know that this is true of all major religions. We know that it's true of all great cultures. C.S. Lewis gave an example. He said, we know that in different civilizations, in some cultures, that a man could have one wife or many wives, but he's never been able to have any woman he wanted. So there were always strictures around what those laws were. In fact, you can go back to Columbia University, of all places, did an intensive study of ancient cultures and shows, I think maybe what they were trying to show is that they weren't all exactly uniform, but actually what they prove is that every major civilization had restrictions on sexual behavior. And you can actually, I've got a link, you can actually go there and look through that document. And of course, the Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics in the back of Abolition of Man, when we use that appendix that Lewis put together, that was a really great reference that he used to show the universality of first principles and things. So the sexual revolution is now being taken to a whole new level. with the sexualization of children. So going back in 1970, there was a law enacted at the federal level called the Obscenity Exemption Statute. And this was policemen petitioning the government to be able to look at pornographic material at a crime scene in order to be able to investigate, especially of children. So then, pretty quickly, the medical industry followed suit, and they said, okay, we need that freedom to be able to look at those images as well. And then the schools and the libraries piggybacked on that law. And that is why you can have pornographic materials in a library, even a school library, even an elementary school library, which I'll talk about in a minute. And it's legal. And you walk out into the street and show it to a child, and you can be arrested. So when a textbook creator puts together a textbook, it's really difficult to get the first volume into the school, but after that, after they've approved a resource, they almost never double check what's in the second and third and fourth volumes. So then the producer of the textbook can update it in virtually any way they want and pretty much get away with it. Now, how this is also being done, in addition to the fact that it's legal under this 1970 law, is there's now this push because of how far the sexual liberation movement has moved. Gabrielle Kubi's, the subtitle of her book is Sexual Freedom in the Name of Freedom, and that's really so true. Anyway, especially at a high school level, but at all levels of the public school systems, there's marginalized voices curriculum, and there's also transgender and equity curriculum, and there's other like diversity and prejudice curriculums, right? What's fascinating is that you actually can't get some of the material into like a sex ed class, where a lot of this is taking place is actually in the literature programs. And so they're pushing it through these marginalized voices spaces into the classroom, through the literature especially, through the lit courses, English courses. And of course we know that the postmodernists took over lit at the college level decades ago, and so it's just all trickling down, right? There's two major obstacles to being able to remove the pornography from the schools. One is that even, and in Texas, several years ago, they actually pushed really hard, and they got some stuff outlawed in Texas. The problem is, even if it's illegal at the state level, the superintendents are still autonomous. So they can still make independent decisions about what happens in their jurisdiction. And the second problem that's happening is that George Soros is a big one. He's not the only one, but those that have this agenda and are pushing this forward are basically purchasing our district attorneys. So what's happened over the last decade or two is that kind of the powers that be, those with money, those with agendas that want to sexualize children and push things forward, realize that it's harder. People tend to pay attention at the national level and ignore a lot of the local level. It is now the case that, predominantly because of George Soros, but others as well, that 1/5 of Americans are now in a district with a district attorney whose campaign was paid for by George Soros. So they know where their loyalty lies. If you go to George Soros's website, he's very much like on the same page with all the things, with all the transgender, homosexuality, all the things that go on with transitioning children and all of that. So what is happening more and more now is that these district attorneys won't allow certain cases to go to court because they know who bought them, and so they can't risk angering those people. The only thing that actually works to get the pornography out of the schools is when parents get really mad and make a huge fuss. There have been several cases where parents band together, they marched on the school boards and all that kind of stuff, and they were able to get books removed and banned and things like that in the schools. The only thing that's helping is parents speaking out, parents being aware and parents speaking out. Now, one of the questions that I had when I was looking at all of this information was, why? Of course, there's evil. Of course there's that reason. But really, why? Like, what would motivate anyone at any level, especially those at a higher level, to push the agenda forward all the way to the sexualization of small children? One thing that we know is that it's a direct fight against the true, the good, and the beautiful. So the good, the true, and the beautiful are called the transcendentals. And they have been all the way back through Western history. They're called the transcendentals because there's no other value or virtue that you can take past them. They are the reason for the values and the virtues. They are the highest level things that mankind could strive for. And they are the three elements that we judge everything by. Is it good, is it true, and is it beautiful? They are how we make judgments in the world. So if you look at, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, but if you look at those three elements today, you can see that there's, rather than objective truth, objective beauty, objective goodness, there's subjective. It's good for me, it's not good for you. Or it's true for me, it's not true for you. Or it's beautiful to me, it's not beautiful to you. And so there's this attempt to entirely restructure the way human beings function, make judgments, and act in the world. And this goes back to Nietzsche and before, right? So he saw what was coming. He said, okay, and people who don't quite understand everything that he meant sometimes will say, Nietzsche said, well, God is dead. He wasn't necessarily proclaiming, God is dead, I'm making this statement. He was saying, the Enlightenment's taking us there, right? What you guys are doing, you need to understand that you're killing God. And what that means is that the old moral standards no longer remain. So what we have to do is make up new rules. We have to have a new human morality by humans, for humans. Let's make it up, let's go. This is going to be hard, but it's going to be cool. I think this is really fascinating. Mortimer Adler, he's read all the great books, and so he's defining it as it's been defined historically. He said that basically the definition of truth is the agreement between what we think and what is real. So historically, education's primary purpose was to sculpt that young child up into their, youth years, to fashion their thinking and emotions, their thoughts, their beliefs, their emotions should closely align with reality, which is the true, the good, and the beautiful. And so what you were doing for young children was helping them to have proper sentiments in the world so that they could succeed at the highest level, because they understood what was objectively true and good and beautiful, not subjectively so. So here's a few people that have talked about this. C.S. Lewis says, until quite modern times, all teachers and even all men believed the universe to be such that certain emotional reactions on our part could be either congruous or incongruous to it. Believed, in fact, that objects did not merely receive but could merit our approval or disapproval. Lewis also said, Aristotle says that the aim of education is to make the pupil like and dislike what he ought. The only way this is possible is if there are absolutes. You can only like and dislike what you ought to if you first know and believe and are aligned with reality that there is truth and there is goodness and there is beauty, and then be familiar with those things and then help the child understand why those things are good and true and beautiful, and empower them by showing evidence about how it bears fruit. That is the fabric of reality because it bears fruit, right? It shows shows up as an individual thriving in the world, able to cope, able to work out their problems because it is the fabric of reality. He goes on, when the age for reflective thought comes, the pupil who has been thus trained in ordinate affections or just sentiments will easily find the first principles in ethics. So they will see and be able to see on their own what those governing first principles are and be able to guide their lives accordingly. But to corrupt man, they will never be visible at all, and he can make no progress in science. In the Republic, the well-nurtured youth is one who, quote, would see most clearly whatever was amiss in ill-made works of man or ill-grown works of nature, and with a just dictate would blame and hate the ugly, even from his earliest years, and would give delighted praise to beauty, receiving it into his soul and being nourished by it, so that he becomes a man of gentle heart. This is a lot about what the abolition of man is about, if you ever looped back to the beginning articles there. The whole first article from C.S. Lewis is about how we are, it's called Men Without Chests, and it's about the improper form of education that is disfiguring the sentiments of children because it isn't aligning them with truth. And so they don't have a heart, and so they don't have a purpose, and they don't have anything to work and strive for. Alan Bloom said, civilization, or to say the same thing, education, is the timing or domestication of the soul's raw passions, not suppressing or excising them, which would deprive the soul of its energy, but forming and informing them as an art. So, the strategy at this point is to try to do something brand new that's never been done in the history of the West, for sure, probably the world, and that is to make up a new moral code, to talk about truth and goodness and beauty as if they aren't objective but they're subjective, to wipe away the old norms and to come up with a new type of human being. Through this turning upside down of the moral structure, attacking the family, and pushing for any and all sexual behavior as normal and permitted, our culture is being destroyed. The second reason that children are being sexualized, first we have to make way for a subjective morality so that everyone can give each other permission to do whatever, because we don't want rules, we don't want responsibility. The second one is because when a child, and this is why our Savior reserved the worst punishment for offenders when he said that it would be better for them that a millstone were put around their neck and they were drowned in the depths of the sea, because he understands that when they're compromised, they often weak. It of necessity turns them inward, and it's absolutely vital that they engage in caring for themselves and healing from that behavior. And so what you do is it draws passion and purpose away from God and his laws and standards, and how many individuals, there's a huge percentage, it's not everyone, but there's a huge percentage of either prostitutes or predators or whatever that can trace that behavior back to childhood, right? I'm going to read you something. This is by Gebra Kubi. I love how she said this. The beautiful gift of sexuality requires cultivation if it is to allow people to have successful relationships and a successful life. The opposite, the coarse acting out of all desires, distorts the person and the culture. A person sexualized from childhood is taught, it is right to live out all your instincts without reflection. It is wrong for you to set boundaries for them. He uses his own body and the bodies of other people for satisfying his sex drive instead of for expressing personal love. This drive is powerful because it has the task of ensuring the survival of humankind. The person who does not learn to cultivate it for the expression of love and the creation of new life is ruled by it. A person driven in this way loses his freedom. He no longer hears the voice of his conscience. He loses the ability to love and the ability to bond. He loses the desire to give children the gift of life. He becomes incapable of cultural achievement. He becomes mentally and physically sick. He loses the desire and ability to maintain his own culture, thereby setting it up for domination by a more energetic one. She goes on, now the attack is aimed at the person's innermost moral structure, one that empowers him to be free. The axe is now being laid at the root. So, of course, we know that our Savior can heal and heal completely, and that's what we want. But of course, we also know that when children are exposed to too much too young, it is incredibly debilitating and requires a lot of work to heal. Unwin, I think is his name, is an active evangelical in sex trafficking movement, and he's a phenomenal man. He said, sex is the most powerful weapon on earth. And I want to loop back. There's a really fascinating connection that Alan Bloom made between the sexual drive and the ability and desire to learn. Alan Bloom wrote a book called Closing the American Mind, and it was published, I think, in the 80s. But what he was discussing was his experiences as a professor for like 30, 35 years. And a lot of what he was expressing was what he saw pre-sexual revolution and post-sexual revolution, okay? And the effect that it had on his students, on the culture at the school, on his ability to teach, and their ability to learn and grow. So he says, a significant number of students used to arrive at the university physically and spiritually virginal, expecting to lose their innocence there. Their lust was mixed into everything they thought and did. They were painfully aware that they wanted something but were not quite sure exactly what it was, what form it would take, and what it all meant. This powerful tension, this literal lust for knowledge, was what a teacher could see in the eyes of those who flattered him by giving such evidence of their need for him. His own satisfaction was promised by having something with which to feed their hunger, in overflow to bestow on their emptiness. Now, sated with easy, clinical, and sterile satisfactions of body and soul, the students arriving at the university today hardly walk on the enchanted ground they once did. They pass by the ruins without imagining what was there. Spiritually detumescent, they do not seek wholeness in the university. These most productive years of learning, the time when Alcibiades was growing his first beard, are wasted because of artificial precociousness and a sophistic wisdom acquired in high school. Aristotle said that man has two peaks, each accompanied by intense pleasure, sexual intercourse and thinking. The easy sex of teenagers snips the golden thread linking eros and education. So it's really fascinating to think that, as, like Gabrielle Kubi said, as you give in to your sensual pleasures, as you give license to whatever would satisfy you, you become disinterested in the highest and the noblest things available to you, and distracted by your own bodily satisfactions at the expense of your mind and your soul. Jaco Booyens has reached out to all kinds of organizations that you would think would support his work, would give him a platform, would help his work move forward. Feminist organizations that would often align with his thinking, but also just conservative groups and even Christian groups. And he says most of them will not even collaborate with him. And the reason for this is, the justification that they give him is that the good work that they're doing is too important to risk putting him in front of people and giving him a platform to talk about the importance of stepping up and doing something about sex trafficking. So, looping back to this second reason why this is being done to our children, it's so that they become passive, incapable of fighting, having purpose, knowing who they are, feeding themselves morally, spiritually, mentally. In fact, I didn't bring it today. There's a really great quote by M. Scott Peck where, and I'm going to really maybe slaughter it, but basically he said, I used to make distinctions between intellectual and spiritual growth, but now I make no such distinctions whatsoever. I feel like they're almost one and the same. And so there is this really important link between what's happening spiritually and intellectually, right? And if we clip that thread, because there's license for all kinds of sensual pleasures, then people won't seek that out, and then you've lost high culture. If they can sexually compromise America's children, they will become subordinates. They will not fight. And the reason that they won't fight is because they won't have anything to fight for, because they're not plugged into something higher than their own sensual pleasures. The venue through which it's happening, of course, is the normalization of pornography. This is something phenomenal Yaku says over and over and over again, and that is, in fact, he stood, bless him, he stood in front of the legislature at the federal level and just told them, you can't do anything about the sex trafficking problem because you're all complicit, because you're all engaging in pornography of some form or another. And until we do something about the pornography problem and stop normalizing it, we're just going to stay where we are. It's just, and in fact, he said that, especially in the United States, most sex trafficking happens with someone that the child knows. So it's either family or friends that are feeding that. Okay, so really heavy, hard, ugly, overwhelming stuff. So I want to talk about what this has to do with you and me right now in this room, what our role is in all of this as women and as mothers. So I want to take us to Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, who came to the United States in the 1800s to study the penal system, ended up writing a big long volume called Democracy in America, so worth studying. This is what he said near the end of his 2-volume work. No free communities ever existed without morals. And as I observed in the former part of this work, morals are the work of women. Consequently, whatever affects the condition of women, their habits and their opinions, has great political importance in my eyes. Long before an American girl arrives at the marriageable age, her emancipation from maternal control begins. She has scarcely ceased to be a child when she already thinks for herself, speaks with freedom, and acts on her own impulse. As they could not prevent her virtue from being exposed to frequent danger, they determined that she should know how best to defend it, and more reliance was placed on the free vigor of her will than on safeguards which have been shaken or could be shaken or overthrown. Instead, then, of inculcating mistrust of herself, they constantly seek to enhance her confidence in her own strength of character. The legislators of the United States, who have mitigated almost all penalties of criminal law, still make rape a capital offense. And no crime is visited with more inexorable severity by public opinion. So instead of having free sexual reign in the early 1800s, women were safeguarded by proper education, by nurturing them spiritually and mentally, helping them to trust in God and trust in themselves, protecting them with social norms, and then making rape a capital crime. And it was almost unheard of in the States at that time. Although the Americans are a very religious people, they do not rely on religion alone to defend the virtue of women. They seek to arm her with reason also. I have nowhere seen women occupying a loftier position, and if I were asked, now that I am drawing to the close of this work, in which I have spoken of so many important things done by the Americans, to what the singular prosperity and growing strength of the people ought mainly to be attributed, I should reply, to the superiority of her women. Alan Bloom talks about women after the feminist movement and how it affected his students. He says, students, particularly the girls, were no longer ashamed to give public evidence of sexual attraction of its fulfillment. It was a modification or phasing out of female modesty that made the new arrangements possible. It was only possible because women bought in. Central to the feminist project is the suppression of modesty, in which the sexual revolution played a critical preparatory role. Modesty in the old dispensation was the female virtue because it governed the powerful desire that related men to women, providing a gratification in harmony with the procreation and rearing of children, the risk and responsibility of which fell naturally on women. Roger Scruton, who has said a lot about the good, the true, and the beautiful, who's just a phenomenal individual, said this: there's a connection between desiring something and obtaining it. If you really want a glass of water, then on obtaining it you feel pleasure, the pleasure of satisfying a desire. But it's not a simple connection, because we know that many things we desire don't give us pleasure when we obtain them. This is one of the most important parts of moral education, to recognize the difference between those things that you desire which will bring you satisfaction when you obtain them, and those things which you desire which when you taste them, you push them away with revulsion. We actually protect children and we protect our culture when we help them to understand what really will satisfy and bring them joy and fulfillment and what will not. So we're the gatekeepers. We're the holders of morality. We're the gatekeepers of truth. And in an information age where so much information is happening, is being made available at such a rapid rate, we can't afford to be silent. C.S. Lewis said, "To be ignorant and simple now, not to be able to meet the enemies on their own ground," and he means intellectually, "would be to throw down our weapons and to betray our uneducated brethren who have under God no defense but us against the intellectual attacks of the heathen." Good philosophy or science or literature or legislation must exist, if for no other reason, because bad philosophy needs to be answered. Jane Eyre, of course, was written in the mid-1800s. And one of the biggest reasons why it was so popular, of course, it was a fascinating, good story, well written and all those things. But the central message right there at the very, almost even to the very center of the book, is a message to women about protecting their virtue, about what it means to be truly modest, what it means to protect your own personal integrity, to have the strength of mind and character to demand that society give you the protections that you deserve under marriage laws, and that you are right before God and yourself in terms of your own sexuality. It was one of the many sources at the time that granted women courage and reason and validated that inner desire to do it right. The founders, of course, knew that there were going to be factions. So what we're looking at today is a bunch of factions, special interest groups, right? That actually make up this minuscule percentage fabric of the actual populace, but are these special interest faction groups. And so in Federalist Paper 10, they talk about factions, and I think it's Madison that wrote this one. He says, "By a faction I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community." So what we're seeing is a lot of special interest groups, factions is what they were called, that want something for themselves that isn't for the good of the culture and the society at large. He says there's two methods of curing the mischiefs of faction. One is to remove its causes, and the other is to control its effects. He says, okay, so there's two ways you can remove the causes. You can destroy liberty, which is essential to its existence, or you can give everyone the same opinions, passions, or interests, which we know we can't do number two. We're not going to have everybody thinking all the same things all the time. And of course, he says the first remedy is worse than the disease, too. So to eradicate liberty, which is what a lot of people will push for, is worse. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires. But it could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life, because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to human life. So we can't destroy the liberty, and we can't make everyone think all the same things all the time. So what can we do? He says, the latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man, and we see them everywhere brought into different degrees of activity according to the different circumstances of civil society. So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities that there were no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite the most violent conflicts. So we know that people really get up in a frenzy and they get together with their friends and they get excited about something and it becomes very, very violent. So the most powerful faction must be expected to prevail. So there's a concept, it's called the spiral of silence. It was put forward by Noelle Newman, that's her last name. She was studying, I think, cultures, but especially Nazi Germany. I'm going to draw this for you so you can kind of see how this works. It looks kind of like this. So what happens is new opinions are introduced into the public forum, okay? And at the very top of this spiral, when they're first introduced, people are the most likely to express a different opinion. So there's this prevailing public opinion, and at the highest level, when it's first introduced, is the most willingness to speak out. But what happens is, you can see here on the left, the fear of isolation is what drives it. And unfortunately, when you have a media that's driving in one direction and that has a predominantly same message, they also help to drive public opinion, which is one of the reasons why people get involved in the media as quickly as they can. So people speak out, and then individuals who notice that their personal opinion is spreading will voice it more confidently. And on the other hand, individuals who notice that their opinions are losing ground will be inclined to adopt a more reserved attitude when expressing their opinions in public. And then representatives of the spreading opinion talk quite a lot, while the representatives of the second opinion get quieter and quieter. An opinion that is being reinforced in this way appears stronger than it really is, while an opinion is suppressed will seem to be weaker than it really is. And that's really the key here. They did a study recently of who agreed with the transgender movement and that children should be able to transition when they were younger. And this poll came back with like 85% of Americans disagree. But then it was less than 50% would say anything, and then less than 30% would actually speak out publicly about it. And so it's already the case that it's almost like whoever's loudest wins. Because those that feel like they're on the side of the prevailing opinion get louder and more confident, and those who have a dissenting opinion get quieter. The result is a spiral process which prompts other individuals to perceive the changes in opinion and follow suit until one opinion has become established as the prevailing attitude, while the other opinion will be pushed back and rejected by most. The end of the spiral refers to the number of people who are not publicly expressing their opinions due to the fear of isolation. So it's like a really deeply embedded survival tool that we don't want to be alone. We don't want to feel alone. We don't want to feel different than those around us, which is where this, the strength in numbers, the coming together of like-minded people is so absolutely vital, because then we can say our opinions with the passion that we really feel, and we can get louder and attract other people to us. This is a process of formation, change, and reinforcement of public opinion. The tendency of the one to speak up and the other to be silent starts off as a spiraling process which increasingly establishes one opinion as the dominant one. Over time, these changing perceptions establish one opinion as predominant, and they change from from a liquid state to a solid norm. So once you've hit this silent space, it's just the norm. It just becomes a norm in the society. Predictions about public opinion become fact as mass media's coverage of the majority opinion becomes the status quo, and the minority becomes less and less likely to speak out. Okay, so understanding that as a backdrop, we and other women like us all over this country who believe as we do have to be the louder faction. We have to be the more dominant faction. In whatever truth or goodness or beauty we are spreading, we have to step up and use our gifts. We have to choose to be leaders. Leadership is hard. It can be lonely. It means self-restraint. It means going ahead. It means taking risks. It means getting thrown tomatoes at and worse. We decided to try, we'd had some people encouraging us, so we decided to try throwing some videos of mine up on TikTok. and the venom is real. Things like, oh, wow, here's an adult who still believes in fairy tales, or get off the stage, you're an idiot, or whatever the case might be. One of the things, just as a side note with all of that stuff, one of the added layers of complication for us in our time and age is social media. And I think Roger Scruton said it best. He said, the real danger, the real problem with social media is that it has removed the social filters. So we used to have to write letters or talk to someone in person, and we had to view their response, and we had to, go through versions of what we wanted to say and filter for ourselves and for others what those interactions would be, but with zero consequences and with complete anonymity. All of the filters are removed. And so the ugly, Heidi referenced this last night, kind of that ugly, more violent, aggressive side of humanity has been given a platform. So you are absolutely irreplaceable. And we have got to choose leadership. This is from Christy, which I think we've probably all read. Just a really fantastic reminder. She's talking to Miss Henderson. Miss Henderson says, "You're sensitive, Christy. So am I. You want to know why seeing stark evil hasn't made me rough or bitter? Remember, I said it was God who was prying the little girl's hands off her eyes, as if he were saying, I can't use ivory tower followers. They're plaster of Paris. They crumble and fall apart in life's press. So you've got to see life the way it really is before you can do anything about evil. You cannot vanquish it. I can. But in my world, the battle against evil has to be a joint endeavor, you and me. I, God in you, can have the victory every time." After that, he was always there right beside me, looking at the dreadful sights with compassion and love and heartbreak. His caring and his love were too real for bitterness to grow in me. You see, Christy, evil is real and powerful. It has to be fought, not explained away, and not fled. And God is against evil all the way. So each of us has to decide where we stand, how we're going to live our lives. We can try to persuade ourselves that evil doesn't exist, live for ourselves, and wink at evil. We can say it isn't so bad after all, maybe even try to call it fun by clothing it with silks and velvets. We can compromise with it, keep quiet about it, and say it's none of our business. Or we can work on God's side. Listen for his orders on strategy against the evil, no matter how horrible it is, and know that he can transform it. Who are you, Christy? She replies, I wish I knew. And then she says, but you can know. You're important, terribly important. And this is what I'm saying to each one of you, that you are terribly important. You are unique. No one else in the world can fill your place. If you don't do the work, that's been given you to do, that work may never get done. I don't know if you've ever heard this story of Sherry Dew. I didn't have time to go find it and review it, but it stuck with me for a long time. She was a basketball player in high school and went to college and wanted to be on the college basketball team, and they had open tryouts. And so she went to the open tryout and paced outside in the hallway for 3 hours until the tryouts were over, and never tried out for the basketball team, and wandered home back to her apartment, disgusted with herself and frustrated that she didn't have the courage to just open the door and walk in and try out for that basketball team. So fast forward 20 years, she's invited back to speak at this university. She decides this is the first time she's talking to athletes. She wants to inspire them. She wants them to know how much she truly respects them. So she tells them this story. Well, sure enough, the coach that was there 20 years ago is up on the platform and interrupts her and says, Sherry, is that story really true? And she says yes, and she reconfirmed the date. This was 1970 whatever, and Sherry said yes. And she said, I spent that whole season, the only time in my career, one player short on my team. I looked all year for the player to fill that spot, and she never showed up. So it was her way of saying, no one can take your place. Lewis said, the work of a Beethoven and the work of a charwoman must become spiritual on precisely the same condition, that of being offered to God, as of being done humbly as to the Lord. This does not, of course, mean that it is for anyone a mere toss-up whether she should sweep rooms or compose symphonies. A mole must dig to the glory of God, and a cock must crow. We are members of one body, but differentiated members, each with his own vocation. So here we are. You've spent at least 3 years studying with each other and with me, being mentored through great works, and you are prepared. But the path forward won't be without some challenges. In John 15, 1 through 8, God helps us understand what happens when we join his army. He says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that bears not fruit, he taketh away. And then here's you. Every branch that bears fruit, he purgeth it, that it may bring forth more fruit. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, except it abide in the vine, no more can ye, except ye abide in me. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, you shall ask what you will, and it shall be done. When you are on his errand, you can ask what you need, and it will be done. Herein is my Father glorified, that ye bear much fruit. So God is glorified when you do things in his name and you ask him for miracles and he shows up for you, and it brings more to his cause. And these things I have spoken to you, that my joy may remain in you, that your joy might be full. So this beautiful synergy, this beautiful partnership, where you understand that there's evil that must be fought, that as a woman and mother, you hold the responsibility for the moral framework of our nation, that moral framework is essential for that high culture to exist, and that when you partner with God, he will give you what you need, that he will be glorified and your joy will be full. That's the promise. You have not chosen me, but I have chosen you, and ordained you that you should go and bring forth fruit, that your fruit should remain, that whatsoever ye shall ask the Father in my name, he may give it you. What all of this means is that when there's a clear enemy, when there's a clear goal, and when there's principled, charactered leadership, women of true character, virtually impossible things can be accomplished. Just like parents who right now are banding together to overturn curriculum that's in the school systems, or books that are in the school libraries. That's one evil. It's an evil that's at the very fabric of our culture, but there are other evils that need to be fought. There are other battles that need to be waged. There are other truths that need to be taught, and knowing that there's all kinds of evidence, spiritual evidence, historical evidence, intellectual evidence for what we know to be right and true, is what makes us unstoppable, is what gives us the rock of a faith that is unshakable. It allows us to be the person that stands up and says, no, it's wrong and this is why. When people argue, when they give us crap about what we're saying, when they tell us that we're wrong, we don't have to question. We know that we have the truth on our side. We know this from all the evidence that's out there. So I just want to finish with this really beautiful Greenleaf quote about leadership. He said, "The real enemy is fuzzy thinking on the part of good, intelligent, vital people." And just as an aside, many of these good, intelligent, vital people sometimes don't even know what they don't know. And so if we know truth, if we have something that others need, then we must share that out. In short, the enemy is strong, natural servants who have the potential to lead, but do not lead, or who choose to follow a non-servant. We will make a good society with able servants with potential to lead who will lead, and they will follow only servant leaders.